wolf and raven motifs appear on jewelry, on weapons, on ship fittings, on textile fragments, on carved wooden objects, on runestones, and on the elaborate picture stones of Gotland, the large, flat limestone slabs carved with narrative scenes that constitute one of the most important visual records of Norse mythology and heroic legend. The sheer frequency and consistency of these images across different media, different regions, and different centuries of the Viking Age tells us that the spiritual significance of wolves and ravens was not limited to a particular sect or social class or geographic area, but was a pan-Norse phenomenon, a shared cultural vocabulary that transcended local differences and united the Norse world under a common set of symbolic associations. Among the most significant archaeological finds bearing wolf and raven imagery are the helmets and helmet plates from the Vendel and Valsgårda cemeteries in central Sweden, which date from the period immediately preceding the Viking Age, and which provide crucial evidence for the continuity of wolf and raven symbolism from the migration period through the Viking Age and beyond. The Vendel era helmet plates, which are small pressed bronze panels that were originally attached to the surface of iron helmets, depict scenes of extraordinary symbolic complexity, including warriors wearing wolf and eagle or raven costumes, processions of mounted warriors accompanied by birds of prey, and scenes that appear to show Odin himself flanked by his wolves and ravens. These images, which predate the Viking Age by at least a century, demonstrate that the association between Odin, wolves, ravens, and ecstatic warrior cults was already well established in Scandinavian culture before the first Viking raids of the late 8th century, and that the spiritual traditions that gave rise to the Berserkers and Ulfhethnar had deep roots in the pre-Viking Germanic past. The helmet plates also provide some of the earliest visual evidence for the concept of the warrior who transforms into an animal, showing figures who appear to be in the process of changing from human to wolf or human to bird, their bodies depicted in a state of ambiguity that mirrors the conceptual ambiguity of the shape-shifting traditions described in the later literary sources. The picture stones of Gotland, which date from across the Viking Age and into the early medieval period, provide another rich source of visual evidence for the Norse relationship with wolves and ravens. These large carved stones, which were erected as memorial markers and which depict scenes from mythology, heroic legend, and daily life, frequently include images of ravens perched on the shoulders of a one-eyed figure who is clearly identifiable as Odin, as well as scenes of battles in which ravens wheel above the fighting and wolves prowl among the fallen. The most famous of the Gotland picture stones, the Stora Hamar stones and the Jengvide stone, include images that have been interpreted by scholars as depictions of the arrival of the Einherjar in Valhalla, showing warriors on horseback being greeted by a female figure holding a drinking horn, a scene that is consistent with the literary descriptions of the Valkyries welcoming the chosen dead to Odin's hall. In several of these images, ravens are prominently featured, flying above the arriving warriors or perched on the architecture of what appears to be a great hall, reinforcing the connection between ravens, death in battle, and the afterlife in Valhalla that was so central to the Norse warrior ideology. The wolves that appear on the picture stones are often depicted in a more ambiguous manner, sometimes appearing as companions to the warriors, and sometimes as threats, prowling at the edges of battle scenes, or lurking in the spaces between the carved panels, occupying the marginal, liminal space that the wolf inhabited in the Norse symbolic imagination. The runestones of the Viking Age, which are among the most numerous and widely distributed of all Norse archaeological artifacts, also provide evidence of the spiritual significance of wolves and ravens, though in a more indirect and elusive manner than the picture stones or the helmet plates. Runestones were typically erected as memorial markers to commemorate the dead, and their inscriptions, carved in the runic alphabet that the Norse believed had been discovered by Odin himself during his self-sacrifice on Yggdrasil, often include formulaic phrases and poetic expressions that draw on the same mythological vocabulary as the Eddic texts. Some runestones include carved images of animals that have been identified as wolves or ravens, often incorporated into the elaborate interlace patterns that characterize Viking Age decorative art. And some inscriptions use kennings or elusive language that references wolves and ravens in the context of battle and death. The Rokestone in Östergötland, Sweden, one of the most famous and most enigmatic of all runestones, bears an inscription of extraordinary length and complexity that has been the subject of scholarly debate for over a century, and recent interpretations have suggested that parts of the inscription may reference the cosmic wolves, Skuld and Hati, and the eschatological anxieties that they embodied, anxieties about the end of the world and the devouring of the sun that may have been triggered by specific historical events such as the extreme climatic disruptions of the 6th century. The presence of wolf and raven remains in Viking Age burial sites provides yet another category of evidence for the sacred significance of these animals. While the Norse buried their dead with a wide variety of grave goods, from weapons and jewelry to food and drink to entire ships, the inclusion of animal remains in burials was a practice of particular spiritual significance, and the specific animals chosen for inclusion were not random but were selected according to their symbolic and religious associations. Horses are the most commonly found large animal in Viking burials, reflecting the horse's well-documented importance in Norse religion, and its association with Odin, who rode the 8-legged horse Sleipnir. But dogs, which are closely related to wolves, and which occupied a similarly liminal position between the domestic and the wild in Norse culture, are also frequently found. More significantly, several high-status Viking burials have yielded the remains of birds that have been identified as ravens or other corvids, and in at least one case, the remains of what appears to be a wolf or a large wolf-like dog. The Oseberg ship burial in Norway, one of the most spectacular archaeological discoveries ever made in Scandinavia, which dates to approximately 834 CE, and which contained the remains of 2 women, along with an extraordinarily rich collection of grave goods, included the remains of several animals, among them dogs, whose large size and skeletal morphology have led some researchers to suggest a close relationship with wolves. The presence of these animals in the burial was not accidental or incidental. They were placed there deliberately as part of a funeral ritual that was designed to equip the dead for their journey into the afterlife and to surround them with the spiritual powers and protections that they would need in the world beyond death. The ritual dimensions of the Norse relationship with wolves and ravens extended beyond burial practices into the broader sphere of religious ceremony and sacrifice, a sphere that is more difficult to reconstruct from the archaeological record, but that is attested in various literary and historical sources. The practice of blot, the Norse sacrificial ritual that formed the centerpiece of pre-Christian Scandinavian religious life, involved the killing of animals and the offering of their blood and flesh to the gods. And while the most commonly sacrificed animals were horses, cattle, and pigs, there is evidence that dogs and other canids were also sometimes included in sacrificial rites. The 11th century German chronicler Adam of Bremen, in his famous and much debated description of the pagan temple at Uppsala in Sweden, described a great sacrificial festival held every 9 years, in which the bodies of various animals, including dogs, were hung from the trees of a sacred grove alongside the bodies of human sacrificial victims. While Adam's account is filtered through a Christian perspective and may contain exaggerations or distortions, the basic outline of his description is consistent with other evidence for Norse sacrificial practice, and the inclusion of canids in the sacrificial repertoire is suggestive of a ritual role for wolf-like animals that went beyond their symbolic significance in mythology and art. The relationship between ravens and Norse sacrificial practice is equally suggestive, though it operates through a different mechanism. Ravens were not, as far as the evidence indicates, deliberately killed and offered as sacrifices in the manner of horses or cattle. Instead, their role in the sacrificial context was as consumers of the sacrifice, as the birds who descended upon the offerings after they had been made, who fed upon the flesh of the sacrificed animals and, in the case of human sacrifice, upon the bodies of the sacrificed men. This role cast the ravens as intermediaries between the human world and the divine world, creatures who consumed the physical substance of the offering and, in doing so, carried it from the realm of mortals to the realm of the gods. The sight of ravens feeding upon sacrificial offerings would have reinforced the belief that Odin was accepting the sacrifice, that his birds were taking what had been given and bearing it to the Allfather. And this visual confirmation of divine acceptance would have been a powerful element of the sacrificial ritual, providing the participants with tangible, observable evidence that their offerings had been received and that the gods were pleased. The spiritual significance of wolves and ravens in Norse culture was not confined to the realm of mythology and ritual, but extended into the deeply practical domain of personal naming, a domain that reveals perhaps more clearly than any other how thoroughly these animals were woven into the fabric of everyday Norse life. The Norse naming system was not arbitrary or purely aesthetic. Names carried meaning, carried power, carried the weight of association with gods and heroes and natural forces, and the choice of a name for a child was an act of spiritual significance that connected the individual to the larger patterns of the cosmos. Within this naming tradition, wolf and raven names were extraordinarily common, so common that they constitute one of the largest categories of theophoric and nature-based names in the entire Old Norse onomastic corpus. Names containing the element ulfr, wolf, were among the most popular in the Viking world, appearing in countless variations across the full geographical and chronological range of Norse civilization. Ulfr itself was used as a standalone name, but it also appeared as a component in compound names such as Fjorolf, Thor's wolf, Arnulf, Eagle wolf, Ulfbjörn, Wolfbear, Ulfathin, Wolfskin, a name that directly references the Ulfafnar warrior tradition, and dozens of others. Similarly, names containing the element half-raven were extremely widespread, appearing in forms such as half-kell, raven's cauldron or raven's cloak, half-hilda, raven battle, and the simple standalone name Hrafn, which was borne by numerous historical figures recorded in the Icelandic sagas and the Landnámabók. The prevalence of wolf and raven names in Norse society tells us something crucial about the values and aspirations that parents projected onto their children and that individuals projected onto themselves. To name a child Ulf or Hafn was not merely to give them a pleasant-sounding label, but to invoke the qualities associated with these animals, to call upon the wolf's strength, ferocity, and endurance, or the raven's intelligence, perception, and connection to Odin, and to express the hope that the child would embody these qualities throughout their life. The naming tradition also reinforced the social and cultural centrality of wolves and ravens by ensuring that these animals were constantly present in everyday speech, in the calling of names across farmsteads and marketplaces, in the recitation of genealogies at legal assemblies, in the commemoration of the dead on runestones and in saga narratives. Every time a person named Ulfr or Hrafn was addressed, every time their name was spoken aloud, the cultural associations of the wolf and the raven were activated and reinforced, maintaining the spiritual significance of these animals as a living, breathing element of daily Norse experience, rather than a remote or abstract theological concept. The poetic tradition of the Norse, which was one of the most sophisticated and highly developed literary traditions in the medieval world, provides another crucial window into the depth and complexity of the Viking relationship with wolves and ravens. Old Norse poetry, particularly the tradition of skaldic verse that flourished among the court poets of Scandinavian kings and chieftains, employed an elaborate system of metaphorical language known as kennings, in which common objects and concepts were described through compound expressions that drew on mythological and natural associations. Within this kenning system, wolves and ravens occupied a position of extraordinary prominence, appearing in hundreds of different combinations and contexts that collectively paint a vivid picture of how these animals were conceptualized and valued within Norse poetic culture. Battle was frequently described using kennings that reference the feeding of wolves and ravens. Expressions such as to give the wolf a drink, meaning to shed blood in battle, or the raven's harvest, meaning the aftermath of a fight where bodies lay strewn upon the field. A warrior could be described as a feeder of wolves or a gladdener of ravens, and a generous lord, one who rewarded his followers with plunder taken in battle, might be called a friend of the wolf or a provider for Odin's birds. These kennings were not mere ornamental flourishes, but were deeply embedded in the conceptual structure of Old Norse poetry, and their consistent use across centuries of poetic composition reveals a culture in which the connection between warfare, death, wolves, and ravens was so fundamental, so deeply ingrained, that it had become one of the primary metaphorical frameworks through which the experience of combat and its aftermath were understood and communicated. The kenning system also reveals a fascinating emotional dimension to the Norse relationship with wolves and ravens that is often overlooked in popular accounts of Viking culture. While many wolf and raven kennings are straightforward descriptions of battle and death, others carry undertones of intimacy, of companionship, even of affection that suggest a more complex emotional bond between the Norse warrior and the animals that attended his profession. The expression to gladden the ravens, for instance, implies not merely that the warrior kills enemies whose bodies the ravens will then consume, but that the warrior takes pleasure in the raven's pleasure, that there is a shared satisfaction between the human killer and the avian scavenger, a partnership in the grim work of death that creates a bond of mutual benefit and, in its own dark way, mutual regard. Similarly, the description of a warrior as a wolf's friend suggests a relationship that goes beyond mere utility, a genuine affinity between the human fighter and the animal predator, a recognition of shared qualities and shared purposes that transcends the boundary between species. These poetic expressions, when considered in the context of the broader Norse spiritual framework, suggest that the Viking relationship with wolves and ravens was not merely one of symbolic association, but was experienced, at least, by the warrior elite who composed and consumed skaldic poetry as a genuine spiritual kinship, a bond between the human and the animal that was mediated by the gods, and that gave meaning and purpose to the violence and death that were such prominent features of Viking Age life. Beyond the realm of poetry and naming, the wolf and the raven played significant roles in the Norse practice of divination and augury, the reading of signs and omens that was a crucial component of pre-Christian Scandinavian religious life. The Norse, like many ancient peoples, believed that the gods communicated with mortals through signs embedded in the natural world, and the behavior of animals was one of the most important categories of these signs. The flight of ravens, their calls, their direction of travel, and their behavior around human settlements were all observed and interpreted as messages from Odin, as indications of the All-Father's will and of the fate that awaited those who witnessed these signs. A raven flying to the right was generally considered auspicious, while a raven flying to the left might be interpreted as a warning, though the specific rules of interpretation varied by region and context and are not fully preserved in the surviving sources. The appearance of ravens before a journey or before a battle was taken as a sign that Odin was watching, that the enterprise was under his attention, if not necessarily under his protection, and the absence of ravens, in contexts where they would normally be expected, could be interpreted as an ominous sign, an indication that the gods had withdrawn their attention and that the outcome was uncertain. The wolf, too, served as a source of omens and augury, though the interpretive framework for wolf signs was more ambiguous and more anxiety-laden than that for ravens, reflecting the wolf's more complex and more dangerous position in the Norse symbolic system. The howling of wolves at night, a common experience in the Scandinavian wilderness, was interpreted differently depending on context, sometimes as a warning of approaching danger, sometimes as a sign of the proximity of the spirit world, sometimes as an echo of the cosmic wolves, Skull and Hati, whose eternal chase drove the sun and moon across the sky. The sighting of a lone wolf, a creature that had been separated from its pack and that roamed the wilderness alone, carried particularly powerful associations in a culture that identified the solitary wolf with the outlaw, the man who had been cast out of human society and who existed in the dangerous no man's land between civilization and chaos. To encounter a lone wolf was to be confronted with a living embodiment of social death, a reminder of the fragility of the bonds that held human communities together, and of the terrible fate that awaited those who transgressed the laws and customs that maintained social order.
The transformation of Scandinavia from a pagan to a Christian society, a process that unfolded unevenly across the Viking world over a period of roughly 2 centuries from the mid-10th century to the late 12th century, had profound and complex effects on the Norse relationship with wolves and ravens, effects that did not simply erase the old associations but transformed them, redirected them, and in some cases drove them underground, where they continued to exert a powerful, if sometimes unacknowledged, influence on Scandinavian culture for centuries to come. The Christian missionaries and clerics who brought the new faith to Scandinavia were well aware of the spiritual significance that wolves and ravens held in Norse pagan tradition, and they deliberately sought to reframe these animals within a Christian moral framework, transforming them from sacred companions of the gods into symbols of sin, darkness, and the devil. The wolf, in particular, was seized upon by Christian preachers as a ready-made symbol of evil, a creature whose mythological associations with chaos, destruction, and the devouring of the divine made it an ideal candidate for identification with Satan and the forces of darkness. The biblical image of the wolf in sheep's clothing, the predator that disguises itself as a harmless member of the flock in order to prey upon the innocent, resonated powerfully in a culture that already associated the wolf with deception, with the breaking of trust, with the violation of the social contract, and Christian preachers exploited this resonance to great effect, using the wolf as a bridge between the old symbolic vocabulary and the new moral framework they sought to impose. The raven underwent a similar transformation in the Christian reinterpretation of Norse animal symbolism, though the process was complicated by the fact that the raven also held a significant place in Christian scripture and tradition. In the Bible, the raven appears in the story of Noah's Ark as the first bird sent up to search for dry land after the flood, and unlike the dove, which returns with an olive branch, signifying God's mercy and the renewal of the covenant between God and humanity, the raven does not return, a detail that was interpreted by many Christian commentators as evidence of the raven's unreliability. its selfishness, its association with death and corruption rather than with hope and renewal. This biblical interpretation of the raven as an untrustworthy and spiritually suspect creature dovetailed neatly with the Christian effort to demonize the pagan associations of the raven with Odin, with battle, and with the dead. And over time, the raven in Scandinavian folk tradition came to be associated increasingly with ill omen, with death, and with the presence of evil spirits, a far cry from its earlier status as the sacred messenger of the Allfather. And yet the old associations did not disappear entirely. They persisted in folklore, in folk belief, in the naming traditions that continued to use wolf and raven elements long after the formal conversion to Christianity, and in the literary tradition that preserved the old myths and legends in written form even as the society that had produced them was being reshaped by the new faith. The Icelandic sagas, which were composed in the 13th and 14th centuries by Christian authors drawing on centuries of oral tradition, preserved the old mythological associations of wolves and ravens with remarkable fidelity, and the fact that these associations were recorded at all in a society that was by that time firmly Christian tells us something important about the enduring power of the old spiritual framework and the reluctance of the Scandinavian peoples to completely abandon the symbolic vocabulary that had defined their culture for centuries. The saga authors, who were literate, educated men trained in the traditions of the Christian Church, nevertheless chose to preserve and transmit stories in which wolves and ravens played their ancient sacred roles, stories in which Odin's ravens carried messages between worlds and Odin's wolves Saturday at his feet in the Hall of the Slain. And in doing so, they created a literary monument to a spiritual tradition that, while no longer practiced in its original form, continued to resonate with the deepest layers of Scandinavian cultural identity. The persistence of wolf and raven symbolism in post-conversion Scandinavian culture is perhaps most vividly illustrated in the tradition of the Fylgja, a concept from Norse belief that proved remarkably resistant to Christian efforts at eradication. The Fylgja, a word that can be translated as follower or accompanying spirit, was a supernatural being that was believed to be attached to every individual from birth, a kind of spiritual double or guardian entity that accompanied the person throughout their life, and that could appear in various forms, often as an animal,